I would like to know how many of you are familiar with the theory that is being called a conspiracy theorist of Fort Detrick. Do you know this story or do you not?
Fort Detrick.
Fort Detrick. So can you just in the chat say yes or no to this? Because as I started to dig into this COVID lab leak story today, I started to see things that I had not seen before. This was news to me. And when you dig, you will get to a point where you find media narratives telling you that this is a QAnon conspiracy. Okay. So I kept digging with that caveat in mind. And I just want to know how many of you know about this, because I'm going to present what I have found and how I came across this. And then you decide if it's a conspiracy theory or not. You decide.
Almost overwhelmingly in our chat, most people say no, they have not heard of this. There's a few yeses in there.
Okay. All right. So Fort Detrick is in the United States. We're going to talk about a lab leak outside of the United States in 2019. Does that pique your interest? Because all of these COVID stories now, COVID came from a lab based on new reporting, never says where, doesn't say what lab, just says from a lab. And then the rest of us sort of assume China because that's what our politicians and media say, right? As the U.S. continues to use this lab leak theory to ramp up anti-China rhetoric, China hit back this week saying, you should look into your own labs. Now, recall that the Department of Energy recently came out with this report saying that they think that COVID could have come from a laboratory leak, and they said so with low confidence. Here was the breaking story at the end of February, I believe it was. Yeah. Here is the low confidence bit that the Energy Department made its judgment with low confidence, according to people who have read the report. The FBI previously came to the conclusion that the pandemic was likely the result of a lab leak in 2021 with moderate confidence. Okay. Again, nowhere in the story does it say where that lab leak may have been. So, we all automatically just jump to China, right?
Right. It's Wuhan. Yeah, right.
So, but China now says that the U.S. has not been cooperative with investigations on the origins of COVID, even with the World Health Organization, which doesn't seem that interested. Now, this is the foreign ministry spokesperson, Mao Ning. She accused the U.S. of political manipulation regarding the origins of COVID, and she pushed back on the World Health Organization's statement that China has not cooperated with COVID investigations. Instead, she said they have actually shared more data and research findings than any other country and contributed the most on origins tracing. So here's the statement that sent me on this down this rabbit hole today. She says the U.S., however, ignored these science-based conclusions and recommendations and kept pressuring the WHO into repeatedly demanding origins tracing in China. It's quite clear what the U.S. is trying to achieve. While claiming to take origins tracing seriously, the U.S. never invited WHO experts groups into the U.S. for a joint study or shared any early data. Instead, it has turned a blind eye to the world's concerns about U.S. biomilitary bases at Fort Detrick and around the world. And so, I was like, oh, what's that about Fort Detrick? I hadn't heard of this lab before. I've heard of COVID labs in the U.S. and North Carolina. Those were mentioned in the Fauci hearings. We reported on COVID projects in Boston, where those were dated February 2020. So we know they were working on COVID, at least in Boston, before we all went into lockdown. But what is Fort Detrick? Well, I went digging. Here is sort of a comical tweet that was surfaced to me from our friend of the show, Garland Nixon. He says, breaking news, now CDC insiders consider that the agency is about to release a document saying that theory that COVID came from a Chinese lab is now perfectly acceptable, whereas once we weren't allowed to say that. However, any assertions that contain the word Fort Detrick will be considered QAnon conspiracy insanity. Okay. So we've all been warned. If you go down this rabbit hole, you're going to be called names. We're going to go together. Let's go. So there are biolabs in Maryland, and they have been subject to, or the question, are there biolabs in Maryland, and have they been subjected to COVID origin investigations? Those are the questions we should be asking. So there are, in fact, biolabs in Maryland, and it turns out that the Fort Detrick lab did have a lab leak in August of 2019. Here's the New York Times headline over it. This is an NIH lab, meaning a Fauci lab. Go ahead.
I was going to read it because people who listen to the show won't be able to read it. Deadly germ research is shut down at Army lab over safety concerns, says the New York Times.
Dated August 5th, 2019. This is Fort Detrick that was closed down after investigations in June and July, and then remained closed over a very mysterious period of time. Now, this lab, the history of this lab began in the 1950s as Camp Detrick. Wikipedia says that it was designated a permanent installation for peacetime biological research and development shortly after World War II, which I had to loll at. Peacetime biological research, huh? It did, in fact, make biological weapons until President Nixon ended that program and kicked that on over to the Department of Health and Human Services in the 1970s. So I guess biological weapons are considered health and human services.
Oh, of course.
Okay. The website today has this COVID lab for Fort Detrick. It opened as a COVID lab in April of 2020. Before that, it had been closed for 8 months in the summer of 2019 after the CDC investigated it. Now, here was the at the time, military.com reported on this because it's a military biolab. This article since has been taken down. It only exists on web archive sites. So you see here that there were, in fact, breaches at this lab in the midsummer of 2019. Here is the summary from this article. The two breaches reported by these two agencies demonstrated a failure of the Army laboratory to implement and maintain containment procedures sufficient to contain select agents or toxins that were made by operations in biosafety level 3 and 4 laboratories, according to the report. Biosafety level 3 and 4 are the highest levels of containment requiring special protective equipment, airflow, and standard operating procedures. Due to the redactions of the report, due to redactions to protect against notification of the release of an agent under federal select agent program, it's unclear the result of the two breaches. So they don't exactly know what came out of it. And then this Colonel Darren Cox says, well, breach is a loaded word. You can say, he's like, while there was a breach, there was no exposure. He said no one was exposed to any agents or toxins. Just, you know, I don't know. How does that land on you, Philip, as someone who's worked in labs?
So, yeah, I'm trying to parse this out. So if they're in a, well, since it's a virus, it's probably a VSL 3 or 4 lab. So that's virus security level or safety level. But so if there was a breach, but no one was exposed, a breach in a level 3 or 4 lab, a level 4 lab is required to be located in the middle of a level 3 lab. And it's all under negative pressure. So if there's a breach in it, everything gets sucked in, not out. So if it made it out of the level 4 into the level 3, and then there's some kind of breach from the level 3, that doesn't happen. That would, to me, would imply. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not working there, but to me that sounds an awful lot like someone was exposed, because that's kind of how it.
Yeah.
Willis Addison worked there. He's one of our viewers. Willis, nice to see you tonight. Thank you for watching. Willis, thank you for his super chat. He said Fort Detrick is a level 4 military lab. I worked there.
Okay.
There you go.
And so the rest of this article goes on to say, like, well, we think someone put their foot in a door to stop it from closing while they were going in and out to, like, let in a friend. That's how it reads. And I'm like, they should have known better. So we closed the lab down for 8 months. It's very hard to buy that. I'm going to send you the full article, and I'll put it in the chat and you decide how you feel about that. But it does feel very much like, no, come on. But just before this breach, researchers from this lab were working on research about coronavirus. Look at this paper published March of 2019. I made a little video here so that I could hover over the authors' names so that you know that they are, in fact, Fort Detrick researchers. So we know now. Here's a graphic from that paper predicting that these viruses, including coronaviruses, this is how they could spill over to humans, and here are the people who would be high risk. This is 1 year before the pandemic. The paper doesn't necessarily say they were experimenting with COVID, but they were studying it. So, I can't say whether or not they had actual samples, but we do know that they were studying it, and we do know that there was a lab leak in the summer of 2019 that caused the lab to be shut down. The same summer, during the lab closure, there was an outbreak of a respiratory virus in Virginia about 60 miles away. Now, we can't say they're related, but we are saying someone should look into it. And the doctor who ABC interviewed said, yeah, this is unusual. It's summertime. Listen.
Tonight, a deadly outbreak in Virginia. 2 deaths and dozens of residents sickened by a respiratory illness here at the Green Spring Retirement Community.
For a respiratory outbreak to occur in July would certainly not be as likely as for it to occur during the winter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do we have a respiratory outbreak in July? That's strange.
Others are saying, this thing was someone in the chat was saying this place was an anthrax lab for 40 years. It's been sealed up for 40 years. So who knows what other nefarious things they've been working on there.
Okay. So did this mysterious outbreak at the nursing home just end, or did it quietly spread throughout the U.S.? Was it COVID related or another respiratory virus that also rages through the summer? Could have been coincidental, or perhaps there were case numbers suppressed in the U.S. before the pandemic really got started, as early as 2019 or 2020, even first day of 2020. In fact, USA Today and the Palm Beach Post found that in Florida, the state had removed records from its website showing that they had as many as 171 COVID cases on January 1st, 2020. They had positive cases on January 1st, 2020, which means those people had COVID in 2019. They didn't announce any COVID cases until March 2nd. Here is that story from the Palm Beach Post, which the USA Today also ran, saying, we know that COVID was here before they told us. Look at this last sentence. The state pulled the records off its website late Monday without explanation. So, an infectious disease lab was conveniently closed while COVID was just starting to break out for unrelated reasons. And then 8 months later, hey, everyone, we reopened and now we can work on that COVID thing that has come about since we've been closed. Here's the article about when they opened back up, saying, lawmakers applaud the decision to reopen Fort Detrick. So if this is all feeling conspiracy theory to you, I admit it feels all too coincidental, because while there was a lab leak in a lab that studied COVID, and then there were respiratory virus outbreaks, and then COVID was here before we knew it. And so what? I mean, this smells, right?
Yeah, it smells a lot. And as one of our YouTubers says, or one of our chat, Joel says, Nathan Rich did a whole breakdown of this. I'd forgotten about this. The Hot Pot King, he did a whole timeline of Fort Detrick and wondering, where did COVID-19 actually come from? So the narrative that we've been spun about this idea that it came from China, that it came from that spot, well, interesting. And we also know that, of course, at Boston University, they were doing gain-of-function research prior to this COVID outbreak. Right.
So here are all the things that play into this conspiracy that we know for sure. I just made notes because I'm like, this is too crazy. We do know that Fort Detrick researchers were studying COVID in early 2019. We do know they had a lab closure due to a breach in the summer of 2019 and didn't open again until April of 2020. We do know there were respiratory outbreaks in that region at the same time. And we do know that COVID was in the U.S. long before March of 2020. And we know that the U.S. has not participated in origin tracing in any U.S. biolabs. And for some reason, the World Health Organization doesn't seem all that interested in doing so. Now, the Washington Post says that the fact that we're even talking about Fort Detrick again, they're sort of saying like, oh, it revives the claim. Here's the Washington Post today that China angrily reacts to Wray's COVID, that's Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, COVID lab leak comments, reviving Fort Detrick claim. Like, oh, not that old thing again. But nowhere in this story do they say why it's a conspiracy theory. They don't say it's been disproven. They don't even really, they just say like, once you start to hear it, no, that's just like, China's bringing that back up again. They just label it an old trope. It's new to me, though. So back to what Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Nao Ming said. She says that the U.S. has been politicizing origins tracing, and that only hampers science-based cooperation on the issue, disrupts united effort to combat the pandemic, and undermine global health governance mechanisms. We hope that the WHO will take a science-based, objective, and just position, not let politicization get in the way, and carry out the origins tracing study in the U.S., among other countries, and play a positive role in science-based global origins tracing. So she's saying, hey, do this in the U.S. too, guys. We've already done it. And then the U.S. asks us to do it again and again. But why are they not testing? She says, we once again urge the U.S. to immediately stop political manipulation on this issue, respond to the world's legitimate concerns soon, voluntarily share the data of suspected early cases in the U.S. with the WHO, disclose information about its biolabs at Fort Detrick and around the world, and give people of the world the truth they deserve. In fact, China has been calling for this for years now. Here is the vice foreign minister in August 2021 demanding that the U.S. investigate the origins of COVID inside its own borders, starting with Fort Detrick. He says here that 25 million Chinese people have signed a joint letter demanding an investigation of Fort Detrick, fully reflecting the people's reasonable concern and justified requirement. So could it be, I'm sorry if this question sounds ignorant, but the same amount of people in the West that are saying, Wuhan, oh my God, it's there, that the same thing is happening in reverse in China, and people there already know this?
Yeah.
Fort Detrick, duh.
Well, we're not going to get the media coverage out of it, of course. But others, as others have pointed out, I think it's in Canada, Dr. David Martin. Thank you, OSCAL50, for that. Dr. David Martin revealing that, and also following the timeline there. As we mentioned, Nathan as well, covering this story. So there's awareness about it, but whether or not U.S. officials are going to actually talk about it, unless you get people in the White House press corps to raise their hand and ask questions specifically of like Jean-Pierre at the White House press briefings, or have the mainstream media actually cover it. But right now it's being pushed that it's China. Right? It's all focused on China. It's China balloons. It's China COVID virus. We have to hate China. That's what they want. That's the story. So don't expect to see any front page stories anymore about Fort Detrick from the New York Times.
Well, if the conversation sort of rises to a bubble, then the conversation around it will be that it's Chinese misinformation.
Right.
Right, which they've already started.
I even saw somebody here in the chat earlier as we started this story saying, yes, this is China state media. This is China state media commentary, like, about this.
Okay,
well, we are not.
But I'm yes, these are Chinese officials who said these things. Go ahead, David.
Well, I just, so this is Philip.
Oh, sorry.
So, that's okay. So I think that what bothers me about this, like really, really bothers me about this, is the fact that they've done such a good job of like just every moment they can covering their own ass and just withholding any information that could come to the people, that now like you literally can't trust when they say something did happen and when they say something didn't happen. And so it's just like at this point, like everything becomes a conspiracy theory because they will admit to nothing ever. They will never like reveal themselves. They're just going to cover their ass no matter what. And so this could be completely true, that it was like a totally
coincidence,
just, like average, coincidence, or an average like breach of a virus lab, and they shut it down for decontamination. That could be, but they won't say anything.
Yeah.
And so because and when they do, they're lying. So
right.
Like, what other conclusions can we draw?
So then, why was this closed at the origin of a pandemic that we need answers for, and no origin tracing was ever done at the labs that we now know were studying coronaviruses before we had confirmed cases.
Yeah, because
Why?
we kept hearing from Dr. Fauci, we kept hearing from the NIH, well, China's stonewalling us. They won't let us do our investigations.
Right.
They won't let us get access to do what we need to do there. Yeah, how about you go to Fort Detrick? Why don't you do the same things there? You have access here.
Yeah.
Why don't you do that?
The only reasonable answer to that is I don't want to know the answer.
Right.
Right? That's the only way that politicians, or we're just not going to cooperate. We're not going to look on that, or just no answer, which is what we got, which is it's.
Or a cover-up, right? Which is that we know that the Pentagon runs the vaccine program, right? We know
Yeah.
that they have. So why would, if they modeling a vaccine after what they've been modeling at these in military bases, is it any wonder?
Yeah.
Of course it's not. I mean, it's all part of the same plan.
So that's the theory. This is what China is saying. This is what we are asking. China said it. We're asking real questions about it because the timing is all a little too suspicious. And we think that our own government should be very interested in it on our behalf, and our citizens should too. So what do you think of this? Is it suspicious or a bridge too far? Let us know in the comments below.
Here's a super chat on Rumble, or whatever you want to call it, is a Rumble rant. Peter Liano says, I'm sure that that early in the pandemic when Trump upped the finger pointing and rhetoric that China was responsible, she retorted with an accusation that U.S. military brought the virus to Wuhan, China. And of course, there were early reports that there were people leaving Washington,
yeah.
Leaving Washington Airport with like special pouches and government, things traveling to China. There were those reports in the early days. Never any confirmation that I could find from it. But anyway, so, and then someone else in the chat, Subsea, says, have you ever not wondered, Clayton, why the big push for the Bakhmut labs in Ukraine?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and the 36 biolabs in Ukraine, right? That was
That's why
deeply
she
covered up.
continues to say in the U.S. and elsewhere. So all U.S. controlled labs, especially the ones connected to the NIH, should be tested too. And so if we continue to just scream, China's not participating, and China's like, literally, here's my report card, then we can just keep deflecting and never have to actually test labs that we controlled.
Yeah. And yeah, they've been calling for this since 2020, as someone pointed out, but this is renewed this week in the wake of the United States calling for it from them. So that's where this is coming from. The rhetoric is intensifying, of course, over Taiwan and the big push to confront China head on, which is what the United States and the Western leaders actually want, which is absolutely ridiculous and is going to get us all killed because they're crazy. Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.